Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Macalino. I'm a director in the healthcare life sciences practice here at Baker Tilly, and we're so happy to have you here for our webinar. A few housekeeping things. Actually, there are 4 polling questions, not 3. To get the full credit, you need to answer all the questions. I know they say you can be anonymous when you post comments or questions, but we actually ask that you provide your name so we can get back to you. We probably are going to take questions at the very end and comments. Our hope is that we'll be able to get through our content and then be able to engage with some questions from the attendees. And thanks so much for being here. As mentioned, the title of our presentation or webinar is The Role of Epidemiology in the Medical Affairs Function. We're super excited to present about this. Next slide. I definitely want to present to you my esteemed colleagues. Very, very happy to be here with them. As I mentioned, I introduced myself. I'm an epidemiologist by training, so this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about for sure. I've done clinical research in many, many different settings, internationally, multi-site, and we've been supporting the life sciences for many years now to do great science. So go ahead, Meg, I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meg Glancy. I'm a manager here at Baker Tilly. I have my MSPH in global disease epidemiology control. Also have done research both abroad and here in clinical operations, clinical study design, and here at Baker Tilly, I work on evidence generation, strategy engagements, and clinical study ops. And I'll pass it off to Kiana.
Thanks, Meg. My name is Kiana Dixon. I'm a pharmacist by background and by training. I've been able to leverage my pharmacy expertise and combine it or marry it with research and medical affairs to develop and deliver medical education programs for healthcare professionals such as other pharmacists, physicians, and PhDs as well. I currently work with the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, or ACMA, to do just that. We strive for excellence in setting the benchmark and the standard for the medical affairs function among pharma companies. Now, I'm really excited to be here this afternoon with these epidemiology experts, Grace and Meg, especially on how we can how that epidemiology framework fits in the fabric, right, of a successful medical affairs team.
Great. So our learning objectives are pretty straightforward, right? It really is to understand the different components of the medical affairs function, especially as it has changed and is continuing to change over time. We're going to identify skill sets that are really essential to medical affairs success and really what they need to do right now and what is being demanded of them more and more every day. And then, as mentioned, we're going to describe the EPI framework that we see as really valuable, where the skill set of epidemiology and those competencies provide a lot of value to medical affairs functions. Next slide. So Kiana, go ahead and kick us off with some of the evolving role of medical affairs.
Perfect. So in order for us to set this foundation for the webinar this afternoon, we have to first briefly discuss the details of, again, medical affairs, its functions, how it fits in the overarching strategy of a drug or product within an organization. Medical affairs itself is a critical department, right, within the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, responsible for supporting the development, the distribution, and also the usage of both products and therapies. I'm looking at these words here we have on the screen. If I were to able to fit medical affairs into 2 main functions, there would be data generation and data dissemination. And medical affairs teams work on these 2 functions both internally or inside the organization, as well as externally, right, outside the organization. If we go over data generation first, this involves conducting clinical trials, collecting data so we can generate evidence on the safety, efficacy, and just the overall benefits of drugs or a specific medical device, right? Medical affairs teams and their professionals within them, they work with clinical investigators and epidemiologists to design and to implement studies that meet regulatory requirements and also ethical standards, right? So once that data has been generated, medical affairs professionals are then responsible for communicating this information. This is the data dissemination portion. This information that's communicated to various stakeholders, including healthcare professionals, payer organizations, patients, and regulatory bodies as well. So we speak to a lot of stakeholders involved in this process, right? This process involves creating scientific communications involves creating educational materials that both effectively and accurately communicate the data generated through clinical trials and also other research. Effective data dissemination, which we'll go into later this webinar, is essential to ensure that healthcare professionals and patients they have access to accurate, right, and up to date information, and so that they can make informed decisions regarding treatment options that are available for their therapeutic area, their disease state. So after we have this bulk of information, right, we have all this data that's been generated, we're able to disseminate it well. What do we do with it? That's the key, right? Medical affairs is growing from just supplying this info that was gathered to research and development or to just commercial to now being its own foundational pillar, right? That's already mean that this role is now evolving, right? The information that was generated is then used as insights to build that overarching strategy for the entire life cycle of that drug, the entire life cycle of that product. So now you're seeing why medical affairs is becoming this huge pillar, within a pharma organization. These insights that they're collecting are here looked and gathered by this diagram here, right? You see a great breakdown of a structure of a medical affairs team within a pharma organization. Medical affairs as a whole is seen as an umbrella term, right, with multiple functions and responsibilities included. Here we see it broken down by responsibilities. So we see evidence generation, medical risk, medical communications, and also the field medical affairs teams. So we have to keep in mind as well that medical affairs teams, well, as a team, it varies from organization to organization. Not every team will have the same image, the same picture, right? In the pink box here, you see the epidemiology or the biostats team as an addition or a resource to the medical affairs teams. These teams are important in providing valuable insights by analyzing those key data that help medical affairs develop that strategy, right? Some companies, they have a specific outsourced epi or biostats team. I'll let the epidemiology experts here come in on how we work with medical affairs.
No, I mean, I think Kiana spoke to it perfectly. Different companies will have it configured in different ways. Even companies that have a separate outsourced epi biostats team, this webinar is really going to show where and how those epi concepts really run through in all the work that medical affairs leaders use in these different areas.
Right.
And then, so the first polling question, and I'll go ahead and read it. I know you guys have a way to answer and respond on the side of your window. How do you learn more about medical affairs competencies? And the choices are other medical affairs colleagues, webinars, external training. Do you only pursue if your company mandates it, through multiple sources that we've listed here and other? So go ahead and take a couple minutes and fill that out. Thank you. So now I'm going to take some time to talk a little bit about what is epidemiology, right? After the recent pandemic, lots and lots of people, think they understand and know, but epidemiology broadly is really the study of disease and the distribution and determinants of disease and disorders within groups of people, that the groups being important, right? Doctors pay attention to individuals and epidemiologists think about people in populations, and the development and knowledge of how to prevent and control them. So there's lots and lots there that you can hear like, okay, wow, that is kind of a lot, right? Not only are you trying to understand like what causes disease, what are the things that are associated with disease? And it's not just the who gets sick or have a disorder, but why are they getting sick? How, when, where, what, like all of those questions are important to epidemiologists as we try to think and put frameworks around not just disease, but how do we prevent and control them, right? This epi triangle is sort of foundational to the way we sort of think and organize the world between the three pillars of the three corners of the triangle: the agent, right? Actually the thing that's causing the illness, whether it be the virulence of an agent, the host, sort of like how susceptible or how strong is a host, like what are the genetic components of the host or the physical person's body, and then the environment, right? Like, are there sanitary conditions? Early on, we knew that lots and lots of reasons why people were getting sick just because we weren't managing sort of basic sanitation. The social context, access and availability of healthcare, and how that might be different by different populations really does impact, where resources should be allocated and where we need additional efforts and work to make sure that people get equal access. Next slide. So you can hear across the board lots and lots of uses of epidemiology and sort of the ways that we think about science in general, right? From the very simple, basically counting health-related events, how many times people were getting sick and how that might differ by location. Just that's sort of the describing health-related events in the population. Where and how do we see trends changing? Are people getting more sick or less sick? And does that differ by regional area? Does that differ by, seasonal, right? Like our allergies and how that might be different during the springtime versus in the winter, right? Describing clinical patterns. What are we starting to see? And is the disease evolving, and or are our hosts better able to handle disease? Foundationally, epidemiologists really think about the research that you conduct to really answer some of these questions. On the right, I describe sort of study design differences that you might need to put in place to actually get at what are the risk factors and causes of disease, what are the causes or determinants of disease. You'll hear us talk a little bit about social determinants of health, basically the social issues that are related to disease, maybe perhaps not directly, but very, very much has a huge impact on who gets sick and who stays healthy. Operational research. Okay, so now you have an intervention in place. How well is that intervention doing? Where and how are communities getting hit differently, or where it's protecting different communities better or maybe not as well as others? Epidemiology can help establish priorities for allocating resources, identifying who gets access, as I mentioned earlier, starts to give you some clues into, okay, where can we do better and how can we impact change? And then finally, sort of to round it out, sort of selecting interventions for prevention and control. And in the area of the life sciences, you can really hear all the different ways that really touches on so much of the work that is important to understand for a particular brand, drug, or medical device, right? Next slide. So here's a slide that, again, sort of take these really big sort of epi foundations and where and how it kind of brings it all together, right? Earlier, Kiana talked about the foundational value of medical affairs function. And really, we say this epidemiological expertise from thoughtful consideration of evidence or existing data that are out there and the scientific literature, clinical research methods and operations, how best to study new questions and answer new questions, and then ultimately key opinion leaders, that's what KOL stands for, and other stakeholder perspectives, where and how do you factor that into how well an asset or a drug is going to do is really, really valuable, right? Just because you have a great drug or asset, if no one's going to use it, or if people aren't, it's really hard for them to keep to the regimen, you can see where and how that really can impact the success of a particular brand. Ultimately, we say that all of these things come together, really giving medical affairs that vantage point, interfacing with multiple segments of the brand across, now looking outside within an organization outside of medical affairs, to how they interact with folks in sales, marketing, market access, compliance, et cetera. So you can really hear, yes, we're talking about science, but there really is so many ways that they talk and interact with other folks in a life sciences organization. So we thought it was important, and definitely Meg and Kiana chime in here as well, to take a pause that epidemiology also does speak to health equity. You can hear in the way, we were bringing up issues that health equity really comes to the forefront in terms of folks getting access to good drugs as well as interventions, right? Anything from, I'll hit the first one and maybe we'll go around the room to talk about it, representation in clinical trials. Just recently, the FDA put out, hey, they're going to start requiring the clinical trials have diverse populations and really speak to, we haven't done a great job of making sure that we include women and people of color in all of our clinical studies as we develop new drugs, right? Kiana, you look like you're ready to say something about addressing health disparities, perhaps.
Of course, first, if we're asking the question of why is health equity discussed? It seems like it's a hot topic, and it's for a good reason, right? When we're diving more into clinical trials, it's important to make sure that the data we're using to base our clinical decisions, these healthcare providers, from our representative of the population that we're treating. So
Mhm.
if trials are not reflecting of my patients, how can I be sure that it's relevant to them, right? This is health equity. Where medical affairs teams they come in, right? Remember, medical affairs teams, one of their main functions is data dissemination. That's that scientific exchange with those healthcare providers, right? So medical affairs teams they support the development of these high quality trials, as well as having these high level discussions with healthcare providers, right, on the data that's executed from these trials, the data that we see from epidemiology, right? We need that help, we need that insight. Um, it's really important to assess multiple factors, right? The eligibility criteria in the design of a clinical trial, as well as the institutional challenges, right? We have to be aware of these provider biases that are present and how they affect specific populations, right? That social determinants of health, that's where that comes in, right? This is all something that epidemiologists are efficient in, and they bring their expertise in with medical affairs so we could have that conversation, that high level discussion.
Meg, did you want to add something?
I think also just pointing out like the constructs impacting access again, just understanding who's getting your product or your drug, why, what's preventing them from getting it is really important. I mean, from a scientific perspective, but also from a business perspective, and that's like a good place where you can partner with your kind of commercial colleagues too, but coming at it from a scientific, like an epidemiology lens. How can we support access to our products?
Yep. No, I think that's huge. Awesome. Next slide. Okay, so we've chosen to take a few sort of case studies in terms of different areas that medical affairs teams have to focus their attention on in the work that they do on a regular basis. This first one is going to be on evidence generation strategy, and you're putting together your medical plan. Next slide.
Yeah, I can hop in here. What's required of medical affairs when building this strategy, when building this medical plan, right? So we see some great bullets here. First, understanding scientific trends. This is really obvious in it and what it means, right? We have to monitor published literature, attend medical meetings to gather data from these scientific posters, right? Understand these scientific trends of your specific therapeutic area in order to identify patient populations who benefit the most, and to also provide guidance on appropriate use of a product, right? Again, we're doing that data generation and data dissemination. We have to understand the area we're working in. It's also important to understand different stakeholder perspectives, right? In order to build your medical strategy, understanding how other products in the same therapeutic area are positioned. And then we can use that to identify opportunities, right, for differentiation and market positioning. All key things you need to keep in mind when building the medical strategy. We see finally here medical affairs supporting HEOR, right, and analyzing real world evidence. Again, this is where epidemiology comes in. It can be used to tailor the marketing and to tailor the life cycle of a product, right? All these points are required when building the overall and overarching strategy.
Yeah, and you can kind of hear how epi just basically lends itself to everything I think Kiana just said. So when you're thinking about, laying out what is your evidence generation strategy, what studies do you need to do, what needs to be prioritized, obviously you need to know sort of the disease landscape, who's being affected, what, where, all things, we've already hit on. And then, again, those social determinants of health, understanding, who's at risk, who needs the product, and what's driving that risk, so that you're able to do the proper research to understand that, and then support support that access and support what the product needs. And then I think kind of touching on understanding your stakeholders, that's really important too, kind of for the same reason. So, what's driving the research, what outcome do you need? This is obviously really dependent on where you are in the drug or the product life cycle. If it's preclinical or you're still working for like FDA approval, you're going to be doing very different studies than if you're post-market. But so you need to know who that audience is, like who needs these studies, who needs that data, and then make sure the data that you're collecting is appropriate for, is generalizable and appropriate for your patient population.
100%. And you can hear in everything that the two of you are saying that multiple stakeholder thing is so valuable, right? Kind of like what fulfills the need of FDA might be different from, not so far different, right? But still foundationally, then the patient, then a payer, then a healthcare provider, right? So really being able to almost thoughtfully match and understand what those stakeholder needs are to the data being collected, and framing it in a way that's both scientifically rigorous as well as moving the field forward, I think is what we're talking about here for sure.
Yeah, and just sort of a quick call out to another hot topic are the challenges with RWE or real world evidence. So there's tons and tons of data out there, more and more every day now. But knowing how to incorporate that into an evidence generation strategy is complex and also really important, especially given the FDA's use of this more and more now. Some of the common hurdles, just even logistically, like poor understanding of how to access real world data, not understanding or appreciating the different ways you can evaluate real world data, and then understanding, again, like I said, how to incorporate that to support regulatory decisions and use it to your advantage in your evidence generation strategy.
Yeah, great point, Meg. So we're going to shift our focus to field medical teams and medical insights. Kiana, if you can take the lead now on sort of framing kind of like what's being asked of medical affairs teams in this realm.
Okay. Of course. So field medical teams, this is just one subset, right? One function within the entire medical affairs umbrella term. Right? Field medical, they are key to the medical affairs team because they're the ones on the ground, right? Their boots are on the ground. They're in the field speaking to healthcare providers. They're seeing what they're using to provide treatment, to guide their treatment, right? It's important to understand the disease state, the analysis of clinical trials, as well as understanding the difference between an observation and an insight. Right? You'll hear me say that a lot until I'm blue in the face. It's not enough to just gather information. We have to ask, how can we turn this into an insight for that overarching medical strategy? Right? I mentioned before that the medical affairs team, they move that needle, right, in building that strategy by using insights from the field. Now, these insights include competitive intelligence, right? Treatment approaches or guidelines that are used by providers. And these insights are then used to find out what is influencing the decisions of providers. How are they influencing decision making in healthcare? So they're very important.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think so. Kind of reiterating some of the concepts we've talked about, but a big one is just understanding bias and how and where bias can be introduced. Also, the importance of it. And bias is introduced more often than not unintentionally. It's not like someone wants to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. But if you're not coming from this place of understanding, like we need to present things equally, and understanding the nuances of why that's important, that can be a real challenge. And that's something that EPI kind of foundationally, always has you thinking about bias. Just being able to interpret the scientific language or scientific literature correctly and then translate that again to your audience appropriately is really important. And then quickly touching on, Kiana's last point, translating into insights. It's translating into insights, but recognizing that should be done in a data-driven way, through, EPI methods, essentially, right? So you're really looking for trends and versus anecdotal data. Like it's easy to say, oh, I heard 5 people say this thing, and now this must be true. But then taking it a step further with some of your EPI study concepts, and then putting that into a design where you can actually analyze it in a more rigorous way.
That's great. Thank you all. We do have another second polling question. Let's see. Next slide. In the past, did you consider that epidemiology concepts was a critical part of medical affairs function? A, never, B, sometimes, C, often, and D, always. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that. All right. In the end, it's always important to focus on the patient, right? Those are the end users. That's why we're all here. The name of the game, as far as I'm concerned, is making a difference and having people's lives be better, right? So next slide, Kiana.
Yeah.
You wanted
So
to,
how
in terms of
how
what?
does medical affairs play a part in patient engagement? How can we increase listening to the patient? Right. First, being patient advocacy groups. They work closely with medical affairs teams because this is an important stakeholder group. We work with epidemiology teams as well to identify research questions, select patient populations, increasing diversity in clinical trials. Right, using the expertise of answering who, what, when, and where. Those are important when using that foundational level of building a clinical trial. Right, building a clinical trial, how to analyze a clinical trial once it is out there in the real world. Right, we're gathering real world evidence and data, how we can use that to identify trends, right? We need all of this from the patient. We can't get this solely from investigators, from our providers, right? We have to listen to the patients, understanding what they're going through in their patient population.
So here, going back to, again, bringing it back to those epi concepts that are related, right? As Meg said it, foundationally, epidemiologists are always thinking about where and how are we inadvertently adding bias, right? So making sure that you're bringing the right patients, that you're, even if they are a selection of a unique kind of patient, that you're aware that they represent a select patient population, right? You can't now generalize the findings that you have on one group and assume that it means like, oh, sure, now this relates to everyone else, right? So just really being aware, despite limitations of every study, like where and how, like what are the borders with which your findings can speak to, and where it kind of has to stop, right? Health disparities, really understanding a lot of times you'll have like subpopulations of risk, or, sometimes we talk about this as like micro epidemics in smaller groups where there are different issues to address that might need more support and might challenge you. If you're talking about a community where there's not a lot of trust of the healthcare community, you have to address some of those earlier issues of trust first before you can even think about bringing them into studies or addressing their concerns, right? So just taking into consideration the issues or the social determinants of health that might be standing in the way. So leads you to sort of personal, like proper use of drugs, adherence, barriers to care. You can hear like these are all patient centric issues that need to be taken in consideration. And then foundationally, health literacy, as well as health equity. Health literacy, especially as now we've become so much more technologically advanced, remembering that there's a lot of populations that either don't have access to computers, don't know how to use computers. If you're talking about an older population, communities that struggle with language, if things aren't available in multiple languages, how do those represent barriers to being able to get care, and that need to be considered and incorporated in the way you think about patient engagement broadly, right? And then ultimately to address health equity so you have equal access to all. Next slide.
Yeah, and I was just going to jump in and say,
please,
also with all of these become even more important, I think, with some of the distrust around healthcare and that sort of ever-changing landscape as well, really being able to build trust and speak to patients in a language that they understand and, meet them where they are is really important.
100%. So I think this is the last of our sort of little case studies. We're going to focus on promotional material medical review. I know that for medical affairs professionals, this often represents a lot of time and effort in the work that they do, but it's an important role that they have to play, right? They have to review all the promotional materials that go out from a medical standpoint. And Kiana, if you wanted to kick off our sort of what's required of medical affairs in this realm.
Of course, medical affairs here, and when it comes to promotional material and review, specifically medical information, specifically medical communication teams, they play a critical role in promo review of materials, right? To ensure that they're accurate, make sure they're balanced, and also consistent with the labeling and the regulatory requirements of that product. Some specific ways they contribute, they provide that input, that scientific and medical input to the review process. Again, making sure they're accurate, they're complete, and also that they're supported by scientific data, right? We don't want any unfounded claims. They can review and approve these materials like product brochures, advertisements, presentations, right? To make sure that they're consistent with the product labeling again and those regulatory requirements. It's very important that they review these because then that field medical team that we spoke about earlier, they use those as materials when they're discussing with providers, right? They want to avoid being slammed with a risk or a fine for not staying compliant, right? They want to make sure that all of this content and materials that they're using in office is accurate, again, accurate and up to date.
Yep.
They also monitor adverse events, right? We work very closely with other teams to ensure that these adverse events are reported with the use of the product and ensure that these materials accurately reflect the known risk, right? The known benefits of the product. So you can really balance the risk versus benefit.
That's great. Next slide. So I think it's important to share, epidemiologists or like epi concepts really focus on, scientific literature and understanding what's out in the literature. That includes that not everything in the scientific literature is correct, right? It's important to understand that every study design has benefits, like benefits and limitations. That it's, how our sort of finders, oops, I'm so sorry. My computer wants to restart, and we don't want that to happen. Analysis, interpretation, question claims pulled from the discussion section is not exactly appropriate, right? Depending on whether the discussion is correctly interpreting the data that is being presented. Citing review articles is not, you really want to be going to your original Sentinel study. The ability to read and understand tables and graphs and understand the key as well as subheading and notes is really valuable. And then ultimately making sure that you're able to translate that science for your different audiences and that the level of information that you're providing, depending on the population you're trying to impact with the brochure or the asset, is appropriate, right? So the reading level. We do have then our next polling question. Although, Meg, did you want to add anything here?
No, I'd say everything you said. It really, I like had on my notes is like the in the weeds science of like the details and being able to critically evaluate, the details, the finer points, like is the table key right? Is the table title right? Is it cited correctly? These seem so basic, but it's things that we come across often when we're reviewing promotion materials.
100%. And I think the importance here, and that's a great point, Meg, is that we just want to make sure that good information is getting out there so it's not misleading and it doesn't impact like scientific risk to a broader population, right? Because now you have misinformation out there that could be both confusing as well as potentially, affect harm, right? So definitely important. Okay, next slide. Okay, our next polling question. In which area could your team use the most support? None, evidence generation. We highlighted a few of them in this presentation so far. MSL and medical insights, patient engagement, medical review of promotional materials, clinical trial design and or operations, real world evidence and HEOR, multiple areas in this list, or other. And we'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, great. So now we're going to bring it all together. It's been a great discussion so far. Really, the epi competencies that we spoke about broadly really include these foundational kind of understanding strengths and limitations of the different kinds of study design and methods out there. Your ability to write scientific documents and really be thoughtful about what should be included in clinical protocols, publications, what's important information for folks to have access to as they read papers that you've been putting out there. Your ability to read and interpret the literature and summarize it in a way that's most valuable for folks, particularly lay people when you're talking about patients, right? Understanding the different sources of bias and where and how you might be somehow skewing or adding a bias that maybe others aren't thinking from that place. Translating that literature to the right audience. And then ultimately interpreting what key opinion leaders and other stakeholder priorities bring to the table and translating that into evidence gaps, right? How do you continue to add value to the brand, make sure that folks understand all that is required to have them make good choices around your particular asset, right? Anything to add here? Kiana, Meg?
All these competencies we'll discuss later, are also important for medical affairs. It seems like it's one in one, hand in hand, how they work together. These competencies are, again, minimum, based competencies. You have to take those blinders off. Like when you read literature, sometimes you have these glasses on that may be a little foggy, and you have to, like you mentioned, go through the weeds and figure out what are they really saying. Make sure that there's no bias in there. So these competencies are really important on both ends.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, we always talk about medical affairs also as being like the voice of the patient. And I think I become maybe not even up here, but really contribute to that, like being the one to understand the patient. And again, it comes back to knowing your audience and translate to your stakeholder, but being able to understand their needs, be transparent, be their advocate. I think all of that is also tied to sort of foundations of epi and public health.
So important, for sure. Next slide. So I did just want this to throw this one slide basically as an example, right? Here are a good number of different kinds of clinical study design types. I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the weeds of any one particular type, but I think it's important that each one of these has their own unique sort of strengths, weaknesses, the kinds of data that you would get out from these different types of studies. I think sometimes it can be a little confusing. Everyone knows about clinical trials, but observational studies are very, very impactful, and where and how they can provide value to understand specific questions about a patient population, related risks as well as outcomes. Case control studies, cohort studies, all of these do represent opportunities and little tools in your toolbox, right? They can answer lots of different kinds of questions for sure. Next slide.
Great. And here I'll hop in here when it comes to medical affairs competencies, right? Here we have credentialing available to understand these competencies for medical affairs. Throughout this webinar, it's really a highlight that as a professional in medical affairs, it's not enough to just say, oh, we have an epidemiology team, so I can kind of be hands off when it comes to clinical trial evaluation analysis. The answer is no there. Medical affairs, you still should be efficient on these skills and the knowledge. It's a key skill that you need in order to be successful in this area. We discussed all these skills here on the screen. Grace, you just went over the clinical trial design, clinical studies that are out there. There are plenty. How can you understand every single one, right? We have to increase our knowledge on this in order, again, to be a successful medical affairs professional. Here at the ACMA, we actually provide credentialing for medical affairs so that you can become an expert in medical affairs and become efficient in the skills that we mentioned today. Whether you have that experience learning how to work better cross-functionally. One of our programs, for example, I think we saw it on one of the first slides, is the BCMAS program. This is that board certified medical affairs specialist program. You can become board certified in medical affairs. Again, it's not enough to rely solely on the epidemiology experts your organization has tapped into. You have to be efficient in clinical trial evaluation, the drug development process in order to build that strategy, HEOR, RWE, real world evidence, and also, of course, how to interact with healthcare professionals when you're in medical affairs. So this program goes into a lot of detail on each of these topics and more topics, again, so you can have a compliant and sound scientific exchange with your partners, as well as working cross-functionally, internally and externally. So if you have more information, I think about my email may pop up. If you're looking for information on the BCMS program or conditioning, just reach out to me.
That's awesome. We have one final polling question. So did you know that medical affairs credentialing was available? Yes, no, and not sure. And if you are, I'm not able to see the comments that are coming through, but if you are throwing down some questions and or comments, please make sure that you leave your name so that we can get back to you. If we're able to discuss it in real time on the call, that'd be great. But, we'd love to be able to circle back with you if you have any additional questions as well. Awesome. Okay, so that actually ended our sort of formal part of the presentation, the webinar. And let's see, have you guys been able to look at the comments, or is there anything that you can bring up?
I actually see the polling results from those poll questions on my end.
I think the last poll is still running.
Okay, awesome. But I can review the first couple. Let's see. Okay, so the first question that actually reviewed, like, how do you get information? What's been very exciting for us since we've been working in medical affairs is there's just such an increased attention as well as appreciation for how the medical affairs function is growing in both stature as well as value, and really being that third pillar of strategy. We see now it's very exciting to see that webinars represent like a third of folks responded that webinars is where they're getting their information from. They're still leaning on colleagues, 18%, external trainings, 3%, and then multiple sources. About a quarter of folks have responded. So it is exciting to hear and see that more and more opportunities exist for training for folks in medical affairs. So that's cool. I think that for the most part, folks responded. 58% said sometimes they really thought about epidemiology concepts as a critical part of medical affairs. So 11% never, often 21%, and 10% said always. So it's a kind of a neat in terms of where and how we're providing value as far as understanding. It's, to me, neat to see from this lens where and how you can see both, oh wow, here are all the things I actually do know and understand about this, and here are some gaps and places that I can provide, add to my knowledge in this area. Let's see, are there any other questions? Does that surprise you all, like in terms of the responses so far?
Not really. When it came to how you gain more information about medical affairs competencies, we see that across the board, especially after the pandemic. Right, they're looking for things that you can do at home. You can do it from your computer. Webinars leading was not a surprise. It's something that's very common. You can gain CE credits while learning new information while sitting in your computer or at your desk. Um, that's why they're looking for online trainings as well, right? So I mentioned that within ACMA, our board certifications, our programs that we offer, we have these online self-paced programs for that specific reason itself. You can move at your own pace, learn and take initiative on your own learning.
That's awesome. And then as far as folks knowing whether medical affairs credentialing was available, 29% said yes, 57% said no, and 14 were not sure. So that's kind of neat. We're glad that we're able to provide some insight or education around the credentialing. And I know that the ACMA is working really hard to be responsive and thoughtful in terms of what does and accreditation end up looking like. Were there any other questions that folks had? I do think that it's really it's such an exciting time as far as I'm concerned as it relates to medical affairs and really in this post-pandemic time frame. I think that anything from technology opportunities as far as giving people care and where and how telehealth has been valuable to the gaps that unfortunately that provides to people who do struggle with sort of technological illiteracy or struggle with health literacy. I think that the pandemic has also shined a lot of light on health disparities that a lot of us that have been working in public health for many years have kind of known about for a long time, and sadly we're not surprised that it really continues to show where we need to do better. There's more work to be done for sure.
I agree. We hit on some important points today, especially on that health equity. Starting with trust. That's only one foundational portion of it, of increasing it. Understanding those provider biases that are present. Understanding how eligibility criteria can really harm specific patient populations in the sense of them not having access to a clinical trial, for example. All of these are things that we could do to help and increase diversity in clinical trials, increasing that health equity as well.
Yeah, and I think this mandate being put out recently in terms of increasing diversity in clinical trial study representation and study representation across the board is frankly going to be a game changer. No longer is it going to be okay that like, oh, sorry, we weren't able to get access these populations and you can move on. And so I think we're going to have to address those tough questions around how do we get people of color, women, minorities, older people, whoever's been sort of missing from clinical trials in the past to be represented, right? And I think you're right, Kiana, we're going to have to address these issues head on. I do think that an evidence generation strategy in terms of thinking about all these things as a totality, as opposed to individual siloed kind of issues that have to be dealt with, will probably be the best way to sort of answer some of these questions, right? Addressing what your patient needs and concerns from the jump will probably go a long way to being able to enroll and recruit them and retain them for studies in your early phase 1, 2, 3 studies. Being able to be marketable and understand kind of like what's required or in what will payers care about, what will patients care about, what will healthcare providers care about in the end. I think will be super valuable. And how can we sort of be thoughtful about those evidence generation efforts in all told, as opposed to in the silos that I think sometimes they've been done up to date.
Yeah, and I think that'll drive like sort of thinking about epidemiology within medical affairs more and more. I was a little surprised that the majority of people said only sometimes they think about it. And, all of these issues are just becoming more and more prominent. So I think epi is going to become more and more at the forefront and part of what medical affairs, needs to think about, needs to train on, and just be more and more present too.
I agree. I think more and more is being asked of folks in medical affairs. And I do think sort of the ability to be responsive to kind of like what those demands are will definitely need to include epidemiology. As I think we've shown in this webinar, it really touches so much of the work that folks in medical affairs does. Okay, if we don't have any other questions, we thank you for your time. We hope that this has been valuable. I know that Meg and Kiana and I have had a blast being able to share with you a little bit about what we know about epi and medical affairs broadly. And please feel free to reach out to either one of us or all of us if you have any additional questions. And we look forward to seeing and connecting with you again. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.